Today is Sunday. It's Chav Zayin Nissen. Zach Nissen. Chav Zayin Nissen. Now, the whole man, the boy, to whom this may concern, whoever may be interested in this, all of us remember the Sikh of Chav Ches Nissen. Yeah? It would be this year 26 years. It will be tomorrow 26 years. Chav of Shona. Now, what people forget is that the Rebbe did not call it Chav Ches Nissen. The Rebbe called it Chav Zayin Nissen. It was Thursday night. The Rebbe came from the Oyo. Friday was Chav Ches Nissen. Thursday was Chav Zayin Nissen. And instead of the Rebbe speaking about the following day, he kept on referring to Chav Zayin. And there was a reason why. Because, if you could remember that year, Nun Aleph, beginning with Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah was Shabbos. Rosh Hashanah was Thursday, like this coming year, by the way. Tov Shana Ayin Ches. I think I saw correctly. So if you have Thursday, Friday, Shabbos, you have 3 successive days, yeah? But if you have Thursday, Friday, Shabbos, Rosh Hashanah, you also have Thursday, Friday, Shabbos, the first days of Sukkot, and Thursday, Friday, Shabbos, the last days of Sukkot. So it was 3 times 3. That was in the Chazakah that year. 3, everything is in threes. And 3 is a Chazakah. And 3 times 3 is a Chazakah times a Chazakah. 3 times 3 is 27. Chav Zayin, which is today. Chav Zayin Nissen. And the Rebbe, when he introduced the Sikha, which ended, as we all know, with that incredible and passionate announcement, in the words of the Sikha, Purim of Taf Mem Zayin, as Geit HaRibber, from the Hanossi to the Hakoil. This is the words from the Rebbe from the Sikha 4 years before, where the Rebbe said the same thing with much less emotion. It goes over from the Nossi to the Hakoil. So the preamble, the beginning of that Sikha was the Rebbe developed a whole bunch of arguments for why Mashiach has to be here. And one of them was at the end of Nissen. And specifically Chav Zayin Nissen, because it's a Chazakah times a Chazakah times a Chazakah. 3 times 3 is 9, 3 times 9 is 27 in Nissen. And Nissen is Chedesh HaGiyur. So even though we're all going to talk about Chav Ches Nissen tomorrow, if you're familiar with the Sikha, you should really talk about Chav Nissen today. So we're back. We haven't learned in a few weeks. And I suffer from withdrawal. I need this. I need to teach. I really need to teach. So we're going to learn Tanya. And what we're going to do is this. We're on page 10. Hey Amid Beis, if you have a regular Tanya, as opposed to what I have, a Tanya full of notes. And we're going to start from the 2 dots again. I think this is the 3rd time. For sure the 2nd time. We're starting from the 2 dots. Acha Indinu. Now, as you know, the Tanya begins with Nigle and goes from Nigle to Nister. But we're done with that. When we get to the 2 dots, the Nigla, the Tanya is over. Now we're doing only Nister. The Alter Rebbe wanted to show Teira Achas L'Kulana, that the Teira is one. So he shows how the ideas that are written in Zohar really have a source in Gemara also. But once he establishes that, he's comfortable speaking the language of the Tanya, which is the Sefer of Pnimiyus HaTorah, Soid, the language of Kabbalah. So we began to discuss the idea of the Nefesh HaLekis and the Nefesh HaBamis. So, if you were here last week, good morning, welcome back. If you were here last week means 4 Sundays ago, Ms. Tanya, I don't know, it was a long time ago, we learned Tanya last, or 3 Sundays ago. What we learned was, we discussed the terms Nefesh HaLekis and Nefesh HaBamis. That was the body of the class. We touched a little bit, but enough, on the difference between the word Nefesh HaLekis and Yetzer Tov, and Nefesh HaBamis and Yetzer Hara. And we also discussed the words Kedusha and Klippa. So we're already deep into the conversation about the idea that there's Shtei Nefashos. Everybody has 2 souls. The foundation of the Sefer of Beinanim. The foundation of the Sefer of Beinanim. If this was a Sefer of Tzadikim, maybe it would have been written differently. But because we're dealing with the Sefer Shel Beinanim, the foundation of the Sefer Shel Beinanim, Tirchol, Achas mi Yisro, Echad Tzadik, Ve'echad Rasha, Yesh Shtei Nefashos. Shenemar u'neshamei saniya, Sisi shehein Shtei Nefashos. So we have to continue that conversation, but let's begin to read from the 2 dots again. I would guesstimate that it's 10 lines from the bottom. I don't have a regular Tanya, so I can't count. But it's the 2 dots on Hey Amud Bey, which is on page 10. Which makes it 10 or 11 lines from the bottom of the page. The explanation is, Al-Pi Mashakosov HaRachavzal. This says in the Kabbalah of Rabbi Chaim Vital. First of all, in a sefer called Shara Kedusha, Uveitz Chaim Shanun Perik Beis. It's also mentioned in the Eitz Chaim. The L'chol Ish Yisrael, whatever kind of Jew you are, Echad Tzaddik, whether you are a Tzaddik, the Echad Rasha, or you are a Rasha. And of course, we now know that the Rasha doesn't only mean Rasha. Rasha means also Ker Rasha, which means a Beinani. Yeshtei Neshamas, there's 2 souls, 2 sources of life. Ukedeksiva, that's written in the Pasuk, Uneshamais Ani Asisi. The Eibishter says, I created souls in plural, and we don't understand this allusion to be referencing many people, many souls, but that each person is 2 souls. And the Alter Rebbe immediately qualifies that shehein shtei nefashos, that these 2 souls are nefashos, nefesh. And of course, the reason the Alter Rebbe changes from the word neshama to the word nefesh is because the word neshama, at least in the language of Chassidus and Kabbalah, alludes to a higher level of soul, a higher level of spirituality, perhaps a madrega of tzaddik, as opposed to the word nefesh. The word nefesh alludes to a source for life. Even an animal has a nefesh, right? When you get to the tzemeach, we come to the plants, they don't use the word nefesh or chai, they use the word koyach, energy. But even animals have nefesh. Now let me say something for the purposes of confusion. It's so interesting. When you learn Rambam, when he speaks about the human soul, uses the word nefesh and ruach. When he speaks about the soul that human beings have in common with animals, he uses the word neshama. Did you know that? When the Rambam wants to speak about the uniquely human soul, what we have in common with malachim, that lives forever, that's before the body and after the body, he calls it either nefesh or ruach. When he talks about the soul, which is only for the body, which we share with animals, and when an animal is born, the body and the soul are born together. When the animal dies, the body and the soul die together. Only a human soul lives on. So that lesser soul, the Rambam calls neshama. But in Kabbalah it's faket. Nefesh is the lowest madrege, and neshama is a much higher madrege. Nefesh is a lower madrege, and neshama is a much higher madrege. Now, the Tanya is the Torah Shebeksav of Chassidus, right? The Tanya is the Chumash of Chabad Chassidus, of Chassidus Bechlal, Chassidus HaKlal, Chassidus Chabad. It's the Bible, it's the scripture, it's the text where everything is the words and the letters, not just the ideas. But the Tanya has a different language than the whole Torah Shebal Peh. All the Sfarim, which are based on the Tanya, the Torah Eid and the Likutei Torah, I think the Rebbe once said that the Torah Eid is like Nevi'im and Ksuvim, and the Likutei Torah is like Mishnah and Gemara. Or the Torah Eid is like Mishnah, and the Likutei Torah is like Gemara. I think the Rebbe spoke about it a number of times. And certainly the other Chassidus, going till all the later Rabbeim, till the Rebbe, of course, they're the Torah Shebal Peh Chassidus. And there are certain obvious changes of language, or certain things about the Tanya that separate it from the whole Torah Shebal Peh, which is odd. It's interesting. The same Alter Rebbe who wrote the Torah Shebeksav, the Tanya also said the Maimonim, which are the basis for Torah Shebal Peh, and it's an andere Sprach, it is a different language. Why? If you'll be the Alter Rebbe, you'll know that, and we're very happy not being the Alter Rebbe, and we're even happy not knowing. One of the core differences between the language of the Tanya and the language of Chassidus is that in Tanya, a human being has only nefesh. A human being is born, he has only nefesh. Finish. In nefesh have everything. A tzaddik has ruach. A big tzaddik has neshama. And in Tanya there's nothing higher than neshama. There's no chaya, there's no yichida ever in Tanya. When the Tanya wants to speak about the levels of the neshama higher than neshama, it uses the word chokhmah. That's it, chokhmah. Shabbat Sheira Ein Seif Baruch. So in Tanya, a yid has only nefesh. If he has the ruach, he's already a shtikl tzaddik. If he has neshama, he's a bigger tzaddik. If he has chokhmah, he's a neshama of Atzilus, which is even the neshama tzaddikim agedelim, the highest madrega of tzaddik. But in the language of Tanya, a yid has only nefesh. In the Maimorim of Chassidus, it's taken for granted, it's assumed that every yid has all 5 levels. Nefesh, ruach, neshama, chay, yechid. It's one of those things you got to get used to. It's a difference in language. And the Hezbe Bepashtus is because the Tanya is written in the language of the Zohar. And the Zohar has this language. The Zohar says, a yid has nefesh. We say this in the Minor Lashon. That's how I know it. I've never learned Zohar. When you go to the oil, you read Zohar at the end, the last couple of pages. So, I'll tell you a story about that. My grandfather, Shus ben Ol Vashalom, told me a Maaseh. That, I don't know how long after Yitzhak it was, but they went to the oil in cars. Several cars. And the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin also went in a car. The Rebbe and the Rebbetzin together went in a car. And the Rebbe said to the Hasidim who went with him, you go over to the Tzion, do your thing. When you're finished, you'll leave and we'll go over. We'll, meaning the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin. The Minor Lashon had not yet been printed. The Rebbe printed the Minor Lashon for Yitzhak. The Minor Lashon was printed, but you couldn't get the Minor Lashon. Because the last time you needed a Minor Lashon was in Rostov. There was no... So when the Fiduke passed away, the Rebbe reprinted. This was before the Minor Lashon was reprinted, you didn't have it. So the Rebbe told them like this, you'll say the Tillim, and I'll say the Zayir. I'll Paltiel, you understand. You know how to say the Tillim by heart, I'll say the Zayir. So there's 2 palaces. Kurdim called the Rebbe knows which shtickle Zayir you're supposed to say by the Tzion. Second of all, he can say without a book. Yeah. So that Zayir, which you say by the Tzion, it says that every Yid has nefesh. If he's Zaycha, he has Ruach. He has even the biggest chus, he has Neshama. So that's the language of the Tanya. Okay? The Maimorim, it seems to me, and now I'm going on a limb, is the language of the Arizal. And in the Arizal, you have Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, Yechidas. I believe this is the reason, and I don't know if this is true. This is a thought that I have. But the bottom line is, you have to get used to the idea. When you're learning Tanya, it's a little bit of a different language than the language you used to from Maimorim. And we know that every Yid has Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, Yechidas. You don't see that in Tanya. When it says over here, L'kol Echad Tzadik, Echad Rasha, the Shtei Nefoshes, Shtei Neshamis, Shein Shtei Nefoshes, that means you have at least a Nefesh. And if you have a Nefesh, you have 2. Nefesh Alukis and a Nefesh Abamis. If you're a Tzadik, you also have Ruach. But that's not part of the minimum. You understand? That's more than the minimum. The minimum is that L'chol Ish Yisrael. Echad ve'echad mi Yisrael. Echad Tzadik ve'echad Rasha yesh Shtei Neshamis. Kediksiv and Neshamis ani hasisi. And the Alter Rebbe right away says, Shein Shtei Nefoshes. What every Jew shares, the biggest Tzadik and the biggest Rasha is a Nefesh. Halakis and the Nefesh Abamis. And there's other stuff which some Yidden have that separate them from everybody, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about the Beinani. And as much as we're going to talk about the Tzaddik, he's going to be talking about the Tzaddik through the prism of what the Alter Rebbe used to call Beinanim. The Alter Rebbe used to call the Tanya Beinanim. That was his name. We call it Tanya. The Alter Rebbe called it Beinanim. He didn't even call it Sefer Beinanim. He called the Tanya Beinanim. To him, the Tanya was a Lebedika Sefer, a living book speaking to living people. So every Yid has Shtei Nefoshes. So we started discussing Nefoshes. Nefesh Achas b'tad Klipa v'Sitra Achra. The first Nefesh comes from Klipa. And of course, we all know how chapter 2 begins. Perek Beis, which we're not doing right now, begins with the words V'nefesh Hashenis b'Yisrael Yichelek Elakam Imal Mamish. Right? That's the 2 Nefoshes. In the end of Perek Av, the Rebbe brings the first Nefesh. And the beginning of Perek Beis, the Rebbe brings the second Nefesh. And for reasons known only to the Alter Rebbe, the way the Alter Rebbe approaches is like this. He starts off with the Nefesh Abamis, and gives you about 10, 12, 15 lines, moves on to the Nefesh Alakis, and gives you 4 Perakim. And then in chapter 6, he goes back to the Nefesh Abamis again. Why the Alter Rebbe does this, I'm sure there's reasons. It would make sense to put the Nefesh Abahamis before the Nefesh Alakis. It makes sense. It makes sense because the Gemara says, Agdem et Anisi. We get our Nefesh HaBahamis, we get our Yetzer Hara, before we get our Nefesh Alakis and our Yetzer Tev. The beginning of the entry of the Nefesh Alakis is by the Bris, and by a girl when she gets her name, which is why our minig is that we give a girl a name as soon as possible. We don't wait 8 days like in other communities. And it doesn't finish till bottom Bas Mitzvah. So the Nefesh, the Gemara says, he's called a Zokin Uksil. The Nefesh HaBahamis is called an old fool. Why is he old? Because he's 12 or 13 years older than the Yeled Zokin Katan Miskin. Not the young and vulnerable child, which is the Nefesh Elokis, because you get it 12 or 13 years later. So it makes sense that you would first talk about the Nefesh HaBahamis and then talk about the Nefesh Elokis. But the Rebbe starts with Nefesh HaBahamis, very quickly moves on to Nefesh Elokis, and then he goes back to Nefesh HaBahamis. This, you have to be the Alter Rebbe to understand. So we have two Nefashas. Let's read it again. Nefesh Achas, Klipa. One of these Nefashas comes from Klipa. And again, the other thing we talked about in our last class before Pesach was we translated the word Klipa versus the word Kedusha. I don't know if you were here, and I illustrated it using the examples of a shilya, I think it's called a placenta? Not a placenta. What's it called? The sac in which a baby is held is called... No, placenta is the tube. The amniotic sac. I actually looked it up online and I forgot the word. Amniotic sac, in which the baby sits, the shilya. And then there's a pipe that connects baby to mother, that's the placenta. Okay, that the first thing that forms is the sac, is the klipa, and inside the klipa the baby develops, and as soon as the baby is born, you throw the klipa away. And I explained to you that there's klipa shemeres, haperi, and klipa mechasa haperi. Before the first sin, the peel, the klipa only protected the fruit, but didn't block it. After the sin, the klipa blocks the fruit. That's what the content of klipa is. It's a peel, it's a shell that covers and conceals and blocks and prevents the spark inside from emerging. We spoke about this at length. So now we move on to the next words. The sitra achra. Sitra achra, the other side. So this is what we're going to do today. We're starting our class with sitra achra. In other words, what's going on in my brain is this. In the last class, I explained to you Nefesh Elokis and Nefesh HaBahamis, it's a Tev and Yetzer Hara, and I explained to you Kedusha and Klipa. Now we're going to talk about the same ideas, but different terms. Sitra Achara and Sitra de Kedusha. And I'm going to ask all of you to turn to page 20. This is very important. It's very important for two reasons. First of all, it's very important because you can't learn Tanya without understanding this. And second of all, it's very important because it's counterintuitive. You would never think of this. Because this is against common sense. This is against hachush, what people perceive. Okay? I guess I'll give you a hagdama. Okay, so just in case we're unclear, I'm going to say it again. The topic on the table right now is the term sitra achara. Sitra achara is Aramaic for tzad acher, the other side. What's the opposite of sitra achara, the other side? This side. Yeah? The side of Kedusha, the Sitra Achara, which is the side of Klipa, the other side, and Sitra Kedusha is this side of Kedusha. So let me give you a preface, and it's very, very important to say this. And it's not just important, you got to remember this, because you constantly get frustrated as you go through the Tanya if you forget this Nakuda. One of the ways of explaining the difference between Nigla and Nister of Torah. Torah has two dimensions. It has a revealed dimension and it has a hidden dimension. A higher level and a lower level. One of the Nigla dimension, you know what Nigla is, right? Nigla deals with interpreting the Torah on a level which is called Medrash, to teach us halacha, what's a mitzvah and what's an aveda, and the specifics of how you're supposed to reach mitzvah, and the specifics of what's not allowed, etc., etc., etc. Okay? That's Nigla. What's Nister? Nister is speaking about lofty things, the way all of these ideas exist not on the level of the do's and the don'ts, but at the level of the meaning behind it, the spirit behind it, the neshama behind it, and so on. One of the ways of describing the difference between Nigla and Nister is this. Nigla is Teira Lei Bashamayim, and Nister is Teira Bashamayim. Right? Everyone knows the story of the Gemara. It's a famous story that Rabbi Shua ben Hananya and Rabbi Elazar ben Hurkanus, the two greatest Talmidim of Rebbe Yechon and Ben Zakkai, argued. But they argued amongst all the Chachamim. Problem was, Rabbi Elazar ben Hurkanus was against everybody. Rabbi Shua ben Hananya had the majority with him, and Rabbi Elazar ben Hurkanus was never in the minority, and Rabbi Elazar ben Hurkanus was always losing arguments. He's always losing. He's so smart, he couldn't find anybody to agree with him. But we know that Acharei Rabim Lahates, Torah doesn't go by who's smarter. The halacha goes after the majority. And Rabbi Elazar ben Hurkanus was always in the wrong. On this occasion, the Blessed Ben Huknas refused to back down. This is a Gemara Masechta Bava Metzia. I've told you the story a number of times over the years. Many times over the years. So when the older Chachamim said what they said, and the Blessed Ben Huknas said what he said, so they said, okay, let's count. It's one against many. The halacha is fixed. And on this one occasion, the Blessed Ben Huknas said, absolutely not. He said, a voice should come from heaven and say that I am right. So a voice came from heaven and said that the Elazar Bani is correct. Halacha Elazar Bani. So Abishua ben Hanani wasn't at all discouraged. He pointed at the heavens and said, nobody asked you. Teira lai b'shamayim. Teira is not in heaven. The Gemara has three things that happened. One was that Abishua said a wall should fall. And Abishua said the wall shouldn't fall. So it stood on a 45-degree angle. And Abishua said the water should flow upstream. And Abishua said the water should flow downstream. So the water stopped. And then came the last effort. The voice should come from heaven and say that the halacha is like me. So the Baskel came out and it said halacha Elazar Bani, and Yeshua declares Teira Leva Shemayimi. And by the way, we all take for granted that the halacha is like Rabbi Yeshua Teira Leva Shemayimi, but you should know that that's itself totally b'machlekes. He may not be right, and halacha Rabbi Yeshua may not be right. But in any case, what you learn from this story is that there's something called Teira Bashamayim and Teira Leva Shemayim. The Teira which is not in heaven and Teira which is in heaven. What Teira is in heaven? Nigla. What Teira is not in heaven, pardon me, is Nigla. Nigla is on earth. What Teira is Bashamayim? Nista. When a person is learning Kabbalah and Chassidus, they're learning a version of the Teira the way it's understood by Malachei Ma'ila, by Neshamas and Gan Eden. What do you know about heavens? There's no Yetzer Hara, and there's no Mitzrayim, and there's no father and mother that you have to struggle if you're going to honor them, and there's no jealousy, which may lead you to steal and to kill. The Gemara says in Masechta Shabbos, right? Why did the Malachim not get the Teira? You don't have a father and a mother, and you don't have to work, and you don't have this and this and the other. What do you never say that Dibris? So, Pnimiyas HaTeira is Teira Bashamayim. Nigla Teira is called Teira, which is Dafke Ba'aretz. Pnimiyas HaTeira is Bashamayim. Nigla Teira deals with the Torah as it's manifest on a level of us, a practical level, a worldly level, an earthly level. And Pnimiyas HaTeira is reading the Torah as it would be understood L'mayla, which of course is frustrating, because to be down here and understand the Torah as it is in heaven is difficult, but to be down here, not only to understand it in heaven, but to try to live the way the heavens say to live, this is what we call in our culture a chassid. And it's not so simple. You don't get a badge or a card and you become a chassid, it's an avodah. So there's a point that I want to make. One of the most basic theological differences, in other words, I'm not talking about a maisa, an action, I'm talking about a hashkafa. One of the most basic differences between Torah Leba Shamayim and Torah Bashamayim, one of the differences between Torah is understood on earth and Torah is understood in the heavens is the following. In Torah it's understood on earth, there's three categories. Choiv, Yisir, Rishus. Choiv, what you must do, that's a mitzvah. Yisir, what you're not allowed to do, an Aveda. And then there's Rishus. Rishus can be interpreted in many ways, but it means you can do whatever you want. As if the Eibush doesn't mix in. If it's kosher, enjoy. That's how it is with the Torah. Torah Bashamayim. Torah as it is in heaven. There's only two. If it ain't good, it's bad, period. That's a huge difference in hashkafa. Now, of course, if you don't approach Chassidus correctly, you have this idea that Chassidus is mean. Chassidus is draconian. Chassidus is nice. If Chassidus would be nice, it's kosher. Why shouldn't you enjoy it? Why can't I enjoy it? And of course, the answer is no one's asking you to be a chassid. You want to be a chassid. You want to be a chassid because you want the richness and the light and the joy and the faith that has to do with being involved in Pnimiyas HaTeira. So you voluntarily make the sacrifice. Any person who sees Chassidus as a prison is using Chassidus 180 degrees, the opposite of what Chassidus is supposed to be, because Chassidus is supposed to free us, not imprison us. If you see the higher standards of Chassidus as a punishment and as a restriction, then it's accomplishing exactly the opposite of what Chassidus is supposed to achieve. But this is the bottom line. In Nigla the Torah on earth says, this you have to do, you have Tayag mitzvahs, 248 of them are mitzvahs aseh, and of course there's many minhagei Yisrael, there's other mitzvahs derabanan. You have to do these things. And then you have Shin Samachay Leisas at 365 negative, you're not allowed to, and thousands and thousands and thousands of Gzeiris and Chumris and Stiyogim derabanan. But in between those two, you have most of Elam Hazeh, in terms of food, clothing, shelter, and all kinds of other material things. The Rubi Kekuli of Elam Hazeh, maybe not Rubi Kekuli, but the Rubi of Elam Hazeh is called in a Shus. As you wish. Why shouldn't you enjoy it? It's not awesome. If a kid, you can say, Dayach Masha Asatera, don't be frummer than the Eibishter, and Kecha de Teira Odif. A Rav's job is not to say Osir. I can say Osir. You can say Osir. A Rav's job, who knows how to learn, is to say Mutter. That's his job. Yeah? That's how it is up in Nister. Up in Nister, up in Sod, you're living in heaven. If you're living in heaven, there's only the Eibishter. If you're living in the Eibishter's realm, without the realities of the Yetzer Hara, the distracted Yetzer Hara, if it's not connecting you to the Eibishter, it's separating you and the Eibishter. And as a consequence, there's no middle. There's either good or not good. And not good is bad. That's the part that makes us nervous. You understand? There's good, there's not good, and there's bad. L'mayla, there's no separation between not good and bad. Why? Because if it isn't good, then it's the opposite of good. That's the translation of the words Sitra Achara. Sitra Achara is a Kabbalistic term. Sitra Achara means the other side. The other side means anything other than the side of Kedusha. Wait. The other side is complicated. There's things that are not allowed, and there's things that are allowed. That only works if you're learning the Torah on the Torah as it is on the earthly level. Nigla the Torah. But if a person is involved in Pnimiyas HaTorah, in the higher Madrega, if it's not good, it's bad. That's the Nakuda. And that's the translation of the word Sitra Achara. So we're on page 20, and we're going to begin, I think it's 8 lines from the top of the page, and we're going to read inside the Alter Rebbe's own definition for the word Sitra Achara. Okay? Pirush Loshen Sitra Achara. How do you translate the word Sitra Achara, which is Aramaic? So the Alter Rebbe immediately says Pirush. In Hebrew it is Tzad Achad, the other side. What is the meaning of the other side? She'enei Tzad HaKadusha, which is not the side of holiness. Now, you're hearing this for the first time, yeah? Now you haven't heard it for the first time because you were here last time we learned Tanya Veda Kalaf, yeah? A decade ago. But hypothetically, hearing it for the first time, you don't yet fully appreciate what's being said. So Alter Rebbe follows up and he says, V'tzad HaKedusha einei. Nothing is in the side of holiness. Ella, unless it has 2 criteria. For something to be Kedusha, there's 2 rules. Okay? And he gives you the second rule first. Rule number 2 is Hashra v'hamshacha mekdushas shel HaKadosh Baruch. Holiness means God is manifest. The Eibishter is present. Holiness is only that the Eibishter is present. How do you invite the Eibishter? How do you make the Eibishter present? So you get to rule 1. Ve'ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu sheira. Hashem does not rest ela al davar shebatel etzlei yizbarach, in a place of bittul. Kedusha doesn't mean not bad. Kedusha means good. And good means batel. Batel means in the service of. Batel doesn't mean idling. Batel doesn't mean neutral. Batel means in the service of the Eibishter. Bittel is impossible to translate in English. So we translate bittel as bittel because the English words either are very negative or they're very inadequate. The word bittel is a very profound word. It's a simple word. I wouldn't call it a rich word, but it's a profound word. And there's no English word that represents bittel comprehensively, so we translate bittel as bittel. And at least on some level, bittel means in the service of. Any creation who puts something outside of themselves, before themselves, that's bittul. Because it's against the teva. The teva is each creation, kol chai b'kiyumi, each creation center is self. Any creation that says, I serve something other, and that other is more important to me than I am, that's bittul. So the first criteria for Kedusha is bittul. And then he adds something very interesting and unusual. Bein bepeil mamish, whether the bittul is actual, kamalachim al yedim. Malachim al yedim, supernal angels stand in a perpetual state of service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Bein bekeach, there's an unusual phenomenon. That there's a creation that's bottle in potential. He may be a big yesh, strutting around as a peacock, but bekoyach, he's bottle. And who was that? Kachol ish Yisrael matayid. The worst Jew has inside of himself bekoyach, bittul, and that bittul, bekoyach, inside a Jew, is kedusha even when he is doing wrong things. Shebekecheli is bottle mamish. He has the possibility, the potential, the strength to be bottle mamish. The Gabi HaKadosh Baruch Hu to the Eibishter, and it goes to the extent of the Mesiras Nafshah, Kedushas Havayah, to sacrifice his whole life for the holiness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which we're going to see in Mitzvah Hashem later in Perikei Tes, in chapter 19. So there's two requirements for something to be called holy. Two, not one, two. Number one, bittul, and number two, hashra. In the place of bittul, the Eibishter rests. The Shechina rests. Here he says even more. Not only the Shechina rests, but Kedusha rests. And what's Sitra Achara? Everything else. It's black and white. Pnimiyas HaTorah takes the gray out. In Nigla HaTorah, most of life is in the gray category. In Pnimiyas HaTorah, if it's not in the service of the Eibishter, it's Sitra Achara. It's the opposite of the Eibishter. Now, you could walk out of here feeling terrible, but that's not the point. Because Chassidus is not I'm good or I'm bad. You know, the Tanya was not written as a way of a person deciding what kind of person they are. I'm a good person or a bad person. The Tanya was written to teach a person what they could be, not what they are. And the idea that when a person lives a life that's more singularly in the service of the Eibishter, they have a greater closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is in our culture called Yitzias Mitzrayim. It's called going out of the limitations of this world. So instead of using the word bad, let's use the word limited. We have limitations. The Tanya, Pnimiyas HaTorah, teaches us the possibility of a human being freeing himself from limitations, not giving things up, but getting something. What are they getting? They're getting the freedom that is a connection to the Eibishter. And that's the meaning of the word Sitra Achara. Sitra Achara means the other side. The other side means if it's not Kedusha, it's the other side. Which is why we find in the Mishnah, one person who sits and studies Torah, the Shechina rests. Now this is a very complicated situation with the Shechina Shruya. There's an Igeres HaKedesh Siman Chav Gimel where the Alter Rebbe makes a distinction between the word Shechina Shruya and Shechina Mislabeshes, with a minyan, without a minyan, but the Alter Rebbe here isn't worrying about those differences. He says very simply, when you see this in chapter 35, when you do a mitzvah, when you're serving the Eibishter, that's an act of bittul. Why? Because you've been doing something else. So we had recently in Perek Mamalef, chapter 41, one of the most underemphasized pieces of Tanya, that for us is very redeeming, very encouraging. Any time any Jew does any mitzvah, it's a Mesiras Nefesh. Period. I just didn't Tanya. I didn't make the book. I read it. Why? Because you can do something else. Period. It's as simple as that. The fact that I'm not doing what I want, I'm doing what the Eibishter wants, even if I'm doing it reluctantly, even if I'm doing it without kavanah, it's a niyah for Mesiras Nefesh. And that is bittul. And that bittul brings the Shechina, and according to what's written in this page, it doesn't only bring the Shechina, it brings Kedusha as well. Therefore, fil echad. Even though we know that you have to have 10. A kobe asara Shechinta sharia. 10 Yidden bring the Shechina, yeah? But you need 10 Yidden to bring the Shechina. The 10 Yidden are doing nothing, or not doing something holy. But when you're serving the Eibishter, you're one. You bring the Shechina. So how come this requires 10 and for this one is enough? Because when you have 10 Yidden, the Shechina comes for some other reason. When you're serving the Eibishter, the Shechina is coming because of your bittul. And when the Yid has bittul, the Shechina rests. When you have 10 Yidden, the Shechina rests. No matter what they're doing. You see, so the Alter Rebbe brings both. When you're a Yid alone, you invite the Shechina if you're bottled to the Eibishter, And when you're 10 Yidden, so then the bittul b'koyach is enough. They bring the Shechina, even if they're, the Alter Rebbe says in 9 chapter Yud Aleph, paragraph, 10 Rishoyim Gemurim. In a room, a Malach walks in, he's overwhelmed. He's completely shaken up by the Shekhin against the Kedesh Chav Gimel from the presence of the Shechina that's resting. So when 10 Yid are together, the Shechina comes because they are bittul, even if they don't know it. And when a Yid is by himself, he's bittul when he's mavatal himself. And then the Kedusha and the Shechina rest. Aval kol ma she'enei bottle etzle yizbarach. Anybody, anything, any place where there is no bittul, elohu davar nifa b'fnei atzmei, which means if you're not bottle, right? In our culture, I'm not a bad person. I'm just not involved in good things. Right now, I'm entertaining myself. Right now, I'm doing nothing. If you're not bottle, then it's sitra achara. That's how Torah Bashamayim understands it. Torah Ba'aret says there's 3 categories. There's black, white, and gray. And most of it is gray. Pnimis HaTorah says it's white, and if it's not white, it's black. If it's not bittul, and inviting the Shechina, it's not Kedusha. If it's not Kedusha, it's the other side. Einei mekabel chayis. At that moment, one cannot receive life. Mikdushos shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from the holiness of the Eibishter, b'bchinas pnimius hakedusha muhusa v'atzmusa v'chodo atzma, in a way that's revealed, el mebchinas hacherayim, in a way that is hidden. Enough. So we cheated. We went all the way to Perek Vav, and we read about 10, 12 lines where the word sitra achara is defined. So now let's go back to where we were doing in the beginning. There's a Yid has 2 nefashos. The first nefesh is a nefesh habamis. We explained that. The first nefesh has a manifestation which is called the Yetzer Hara. We explained that. This nefesh comes from Klipa. We explained that. And now we're adding that it comes from Sitra Achara. And we just explained Sitra Achara. Now, of course, you're all thinking it, so I'm going to tell you. The Tanya does speak about Klipas Noiga and Sholish Klipas Hatmeyas. In other words, in Kabbalah, there also is a difference between the gray and the black. Because Klipas Nega can be uplifted. Sholosh Klipas Atmeis Lagamri cannot be uplifted. There's a gray and there's a black, even in Pnimis HaTorah, even in Kabbalah. But that's only in the possibility to correct. As it is, it's not Sad HaGedusha. And if it's not Sad HaGedusha, it's Sad Achara. Yeah. To give it to you in different words. And it happens to be connected to the Parashat HaShavua. Last week's Parashat Shmini, and this week's Parashat Tazim Tzera. We have 3 terms, yeah? We have 3 terms. Chayiv, Isser, Reshus. We have 3 terms, yeah? Kedusha, Klipas Nega, and Shol, Klipas Atmeis Lagamri. Yeah? Let me ask you a question. There's Tahara and there's Tumah. What's in between? There's Toir and there's Tomei. There's no in between. So the Alter Rebbe in the Tanya says this a lot, and people never notice this. But over the Tanya, you see it more and more. Klipa equals Tumah. Kedusha equals Tahara. And it doesn't make a difference which Klipa it is. Klipa Sneg is also Tumah. Or Tumah you can correct, but it's Tumah. So even though in Pnimius HaTorah you also have a gray, but the gray is only a gray in terms of what you can correct. In terms of what it is, there's Sitra de Kedusha, which has 2 rules. Bittul, and therefore the Kedusha, the Shechina, the Kedusha, the Eibishter rest. And Sad Achara, Sitra Achara is everything other. Okay? So we defined another word. Yeah? It took us 35 minutes, and with 40 minutes, we'd find one word, Sitra Achara. So we know what Nefesh Habamis is, we know what Yetzer Hara is, we know what Nefesh Halakis is, we know what Yetzer Teva is, we did all of these things. We know what Klipa is, and we now know what Sitra Achara is. And then the Alter Rebbe adds, V'hi HaMislabesh is B'damod. And the Nefesh Habamis is in the blood, Lahacha is haguf, to give life to the body. Who could exceed, as the Pasuk says, Ki nefesh habosor badam hi. The spirit of a person, the nefesh of a person, is in the blood. Now, I'm looking here at these notes, and I don't see a commentary on this. But you need to understand that there's 2 different psukim. Here it says nefesh habosor badam. There's 2 separate things. The blood is physical, and inside the blood is life, nefesh, right? But there's also a pasuk, hadam hu hanefesh. Not that life is in the blood. Blood itself is nefesh. Blood itself is life. And I've never come across in Chassidus an analysis of this difference. There's got to be a sikha. It has to be. But I don't know all the sichas. And this is a compilation of all the Torah from the Rabbeim, and I don't see here a commentary about this contradiction between these two psukim. To me, it's a blatant contradiction, and I don't see it, which is my problem. But this is the next point. The next point is, that's on our agenda to explore, is where the Nefesh HaLokis and the Nefesh HaBahamis sit in the person. Okay? And the Nefesh HaBahamis is in the blood. You'll see next Sunday, Mitzvah Hashem, you don't hate for all of us, the Nefesh HaLokis is in the Mayach. And next week we're going to also cheat, and we're going to read a piece from the beginning of Perek Tes. In other words, what I'm doing is I'm opening the Tanya, is I'm translating the basic terms. We're wasting time, as they say in the culture. I'm going through each of the critical ideas and developing them so that when we start the Tanya, we have the Shalom Aleichem. We define Nefesh HaLokis, Nefesh HaBahamis, we define Yesod Yetzer Hara, we define Kedusha and Klipa, we define Sitra Achara. Next week we're going to talk about the homes, the relative homes of the Nefesh HaLokis and the Nefesh HaBahamis. Okay.